Okay, so some of you may have heard about how the Verge made a video on how to build a $2,000 gaming PC. Came out September 13th. So we're going to take a look at that and just see how wrong it went.
So a few years ago, TC, our managing editor, built a gaming desktop, but it's kind of out of date and it's definitely not going to hold up for Battlefield 5. So let's build a new one. You can build a gaming desktop for around $1,000, but I want to go all out, so I spent around $2,000. PC like this is going to be able to play most games at ultra settings. So what do you need to build a desktop? Well, of course, first you need a table. Preferably not metal. If it's going to be metal, have an anti-static working surface layered on top of it, a thermal paste applicator, an Allen wrench, some tweezers to tighten up the wires.
Did he just call those tweezers? Like, those aren't tweezers. Those are zip ties, or whatever you want to call them. These are tweezers. Those are zip ties. Also, he did make a good point about the anti-static, but it's not entirely necessary. Just make sure you're well grounded.
A Swiss Army knife, which hopefully has a Phillips head screwdriver in it.
Hopefully has. If you're going to be building a computer, have a screwdriver.
And last but not least, an anti-static bracelet, which is to protect you and the parts. These are the parts you're going to need, but more...
That is just a wristband. That is not anti-static. An anti-static wristband has a little cord that runs from the wristband to something to clip it on, be it anything grounded, so that you don't shock yourself. All that is accessorizing.
Last but not least, RAM, or random access memory, and your hard drive are good examples of short-term and long-term memory.
Well, he is right. That's not exactly the best explanation. It makes it sound like they do basically the same thing, but they don't. The hard drive, yes, it stores things. The RAM is short-term for what's actively going on.
We have a lot of boxes and a lot of PC parts, so it's best you unbox them, isolate the parts that you really need, place items into the case, and make sure that they all fit, and then start working.
Okay, so for one, you usually don't need or even want to unbox things until you're ready to use them. That way they're not in the way. And also, although checking that they fit isn't a bad idea, especially for the radiator like he has.
Really going to start building by adding the motherboard in. Some notes about installing motherboards: they're really delicate, you should be really careful with them, and screw in with confidence, but also don't screw in too hard, otherwise...
Okay, that's one way of putting it, but motherboards aren't too delicate. That it makes it sound like they're a lot more delicate than they are.
The board. I chose Asus's Z370 motherboard for two main reasons. One, it has built-in Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, and also it has support for NVMe SSDs, meaning you can get really fast SSDs that are really easy to install.
Most motherboards that are modern do have Bluetooth and Wi-Fi built in, especially in the form factor he's using. So it was kind of it would have been hard to find one that didn't.
Pay close attention to the brace that goes at the back.
That's not a brace, that is an I/O shield
Of the computer. You always have to make sure that you really hammer it in, because there's no screw, it really just has to go outside.
Also, I would like to point out, he didn't even mention installing the standoffs. I don't know if they came pre-installed in this case, but he didn't mention it.
Side of the case and clasp onto the frame. And this is very important because otherwise you can't align the motherboard correctly with the holes. We're just going to start installing.
Well, yeah, true. If you put the I/O shield in wrong, it's hard to align it. But if you don't put it in at all, it's super easy. You just have to take everything back out afterwards.
Installing all 8 screws. So next we're going to install the RAM on the motherboard. I chose Corsair's 16GB Vengeance LED RAM for two main reasons. One, it has LEDs and we do like lights in our gaming desktops. Secondly, it's pretty fast RAM. It's 2666 megahertz, I believe, so it's pretty fast, and this motherboard supports that speed, which is most important. Open the slots first and just align.
You have 2 sticks. You don't need to open all of them.
The stick with the middle of the strip, not with the end.
You want to align the stick. You want to make sure that that little notch lines up with the little notch in the board. Otherwise, it's, well, not going to go in all the way.
And just lining that up with the logo. So once you hear that solid clasp and you don't see the gold connectors on the side anymore, that's when you know the RAM is in. Step 3, we're going to...
Okay, before he gets to the SSD, I would like to point out, I can't get rid of the timer, that RAM is in the wrong slots. It needs, most motherboards that have 4 slots do every other for dual channel. Otherwise, you lose bandwidth, which means your stuff won't transfer as fast. Will it be noticeable? Probably not, but if you have the option and it's easy to do, why not do it?
To install the hard drive, or in this case, the NVMe SSD.
Okay, a hard drive and an SSD are basically the same thing, but they're also different. A hard drive has mechanical spinning platters in them. That's why they make noise. And an SSD is solid state. It has no moving parts.
Format of solid state drive so that I could input it into the motherboard without having to worry about extra wires or putting it in a separate part of the case and just getting really messy. This is from Kingston and it's 480 gigabytes, so it's not a lot, but you can always upgrade this and swap it out, and it's only held down by...
Okay, swapping out any drive, especially if it's your only one, is a pain because you have to transfer everything too. If you wanted to expand, that's another thing.
Unscrew and the latch, so it's really simple and really straightforward. Okay, so step 4, we're going to install the graphics card. I chose P&Y's GTX 1080, which is overclocked, and so it's a pretty easy installation. You're just going to find the gold connectors, and you're going to line this bracket with the back end bracket.
Okay, you don't need to line that part up. You want to align the connectors at the bottom. Doesn't matter how well you line up this part. If the connector down at the bottom isn't lined up right, it's not going to go in.
Now, which lane you choose depends entirely on what other parts you're going to put in the system.
You always want your graphics card in the top one because it has direct, in simple terms, it has direct communication with the CPU. If you put in lower ones, it may not, which will decrease the effective speed of it, or how fast it's able to transfer its information. So you always want it in the top one.
I'm just going to pick the top one because the SSD is at the bottom and I don't want to cover it. I just think it looks nice. Click down. Take your remaining brackets and just put them in the spots that you have.
Those are PCI shields, or covers. Also, you don't need to take those out unless you're using them. So taking these 2 out was fine. There was no need to take those 2 out.
Haven't used. You don't have to screw these in. They get bolted down by the back end bracket.
It makes a lot of assumptions or generalizations for all cases. This is not the case. Most of them don't have a little clip like that. These will need to be screwed in place. Same with the graphics card. If you look, it doesn't look like it's actually secured in place properly.
And your GPU is installed. Power supply time. I chose Corsair's 850 watt power supply because I need enough headroom for ray tracing GPUs when they come out, and I don't want...
Okay, he's got a good point here. We don't know yet how much the RTX 2080 and 2080 Ti, how much power they're going to draw. So while a 600 watt would have done for this build, you know, he doesn't want to upgrade the power supply. I've got a 1000 watt in mine. I don't need it, but it's nice to have in case I want to upgrade later.
I want to have to upgrade it again. So all you have to do is take the brick and make sure that you align it with these little insulating pads so that the power supply doesn't short circuit and come into contact with the rest of the system.
That's never going to happen unless it's a very low quality power supply. Those are anti-vibration feet. That way, as the fan on the power supply spins up, it's not rattling around in there. It's not. You don't have to worry about it short circuiting because that box is entirely self-contained.
So just take it in, slide it in nice and easy until you have a snug fit, and then shift it to the back. And
also, there are no rubber pads right here, so it's not okay to touch here, but it is okay to touch here. And on an unrelated note, the fan is facing the inside. While some cases this is fine if there's a room above the fan for it to pull air, that is not the case with this one. You want it flipped the other way so the power supply can get air so it can cool itself off. Just like every other part, it needs to be cooled off.
it's right up against the frame. Now you just take the required screws and you tighten and screw in.
Also, the fact that it might short circuit by touching the case, but completely wouldn't if with metal screws going through it. Okay.
The next step, we're going to install the CPU cooler. In this case, it's going to go on the top end of the case, and we're just going to have the hose hang out for a little while until we install the processor, which is going to come a little later. Always be sure to try to place it in the system first before you install it, because you can see it takes up a lot of space.
That's why you check your clearance before, which that was one thing. He did make a good point. Make sure your radiator will fit. But Part Picker is usually pretty good about telling whether or not you'll have clearance or not. Plus, a lot of cases, if you look on the website and whatnot, will tell you what size radiators they fit.
In this case, no pun intended, it fits in perfectly, and we're going to start screwing it in. And so there's nothing special about this screwing in process. They're just really long screws because they go through the entire frame of the cooler.
They aren't supposed to. Those screws are actually for if you wanted the fans on the same side as where you're having to screw it in through. That way the screws can go through the fans and into the radiator. Not to mention he's not putting any fans on this at all. That's not going to do well.
And they take forever. So next up, cables. Every power supply is going to come with a big bag of Velcro cables.
No, again, generalization that is not true. Every modular power supply will very likely come with a bag like that. Semi-modular will probably as well. Non-modular, all the cables are plugged in and you can't remove them.
Kind of daunting at first, so you always have to find the ones that are going to fit. In this case, you need to match those cables with the correct descriptions on the power supply. Next step is we're connecting the power supply to the motherboard with a 24-pin cable. We're just matching that cable from the motherboard, threading it through the back, and attaching the 24-pin header to the power supply so that we can have one of the connections complete. The next
nothing wrong there. It's just usually easier to do all the cords at once.
few additions will be for the GPU, for any specific ports that the case has, for any lighting that the case has, the CPU cooler,
which looks like he's doing
anything else really. We're installing the CPU, the heart of the computer or the brain, depending on how you look at it. So to do this, we're just going to remove the plastic covering that they put on the motherboard.
I would like to point out that it is usually easier to put the CPU, not only the CPU but the RAM as well, into the motherboard before you put the motherboard in the case, especially such a small case because you don't have as much room to work your hands around in there. And depending on the cooler, you can sometimes install the cooler as well. Especially if the motherboard or the motherboard tray, the big tray on that the motherboard sits on in the case, doesn't have a cutout to allow for screws to allow you to work on it from the back, which a lot of CPU coolers need.
We're just going to take this little plastic part out. We'll just toss that out of here.
No, you don't toss that. If you ever want to store the board or send it back for RMA or for anything, you need that little plastic cover. In the case of Intel boards, that protects the pins in the socket. You damage those, you're SOL usually, unless you can manage to fix them.
And now we have an exposed CPU holder, or rather slot.
It's a socket. It is called a socket.
On the motherboard. And we're going to use the CPU applicator. This is a special little part that not everyone may get, but this...
See, using that thermal paste spreader to push that in place. Oh boy. Also, you don't need that little insert thing that comes with the board. It goes in there very easily. You just kind of plop it in.
This motherboard that we got from ASUS definitely does have. It's called a CPU installation tool. It makes it really useful if you want to install a Core i7 hexa-core CPU. Yeah, we've got one, and it's an 8th generation chip, and it's ready to go.
Yeah, they've got one. It's not like it's commercially available or anything. I've got one in my computer. Otherwise, I'd show you the chip. That's just the box.
And it supports overclocking. So what having this little installer does for you is it's basically a brace that you can apply right to the CPU.
He likes the word
and light
brace.
it up with the triangles that you'll see on the bottom left corners. And this will make it easier for us to apply it to the motherboard and then apply thermal paste and then apply a CPU cooler on top. And we're just going to carefully lean it down into the system and make sure that everything lines up, and we're going to clasp down on it and we'll be good to go. So we're about to apply thermal paste to the CPU. Every CPU cooler actually comes with a bit of thermal paste already neatly applied in a certain...
Wrong. Actually, from my experience, most of them do not come pre-applied with thermal paste.
Circle around it, but it's usually not enough. It's good, essentially PC building practice to have a little bit extra. And
okay, I want to agree and disagree. 1, yes, it's usually plenty. 2, while yes, it is a good idea to usually have some thermal paste with you just in case. The aftermarket coolers I've dealt with have usually had little tubes that came with it, but it's also not a bad idea to have your own tube, because if you have to reseat it later or something.
Layer it on top of the CPU.
Also, that is way too much.
The final portion is to add the CPU cooler to the top end of the processor. So you're gonna
that's cringy. That's too much paste. I mean, if half of that might do, and what's on the cooler alone would do, but that plus the cooler is definitely way too much. You get too much on there and it actually reduces thermal effectiveness because it has to transfer through more material. Think about it. If you put a towel on something hot, it doesn't feel as hot. The more towels you put on it, the less hot it feels because it's not transferring the heat.
You can see that there are 4 brackets, or rather like screws in here with brackets and holders right here. And they're going to keep the cooler raised off the processor, but it's also going to be close enough to actually physically come in contact with it, like basically keep it cool. Take thumb screws like this and just screw them on. So now that our internals are done, we're going to put all the panels back on, which is the top glass, side glass, front glass, and of course the back panel where all of this fun stuff is happening. So we fully built the PC, everything's put together.
Whoa.
All of this fun stuff is happening. So we fully built the PC.
That case is like 30% empty space on that end. That is terrible cable management. I'm not saying I'm the best, but like when you've got basically a third of your case to just hide all the cables in, there's no excuse for that mess of cables.
Everything's put together, and we got to the post screen. So what's next? Well, you need a USB flash drive with your Windows.
Okay, so I'm just going to cut it off here. There was something else. Where'd it go? Let's see here. Where'd it go? I had it pointed out to me that he only put 3 of the 4 screws in for the CPU cooler, so it's not making full contact. But I can't find the angle that supports that. I'm just going to skip his bragging about it. So, yeah, that was just... There were a lot of problems about that. If you want to build a computer, check out some actual tech tuber. Jay's 2 Cents, Paul's Hardware, Bitwit, Science Studio, Linus Tech Tips. Heck, I've even got a video up if you want to check it out. I've learned that these were active at one point. The like-dislike has been disabled. So have the comments because so many people were commenting on how bad it was. That'll do it for this video. Thanks for watching and have a good one.